Hello there, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be covering the most destructive conflict of the 24th century, the Dominion War. The Dominion War raged at its hottest between 2373 and 2375 before being ended at the Treaty of Bajor, which took place on Deep Space Nine, where all the major belligerents, notably the female changeling, the Breen, would all be present to sign it off and go, yeah, the war is over. But up until that point, the war had become one of the most destructive, with countless dead on both sides. The numbers of the exact figures of dead on the Dominion side are unknown. We do know that purely just the civilian deaths on Cardassia Prime numbered 800 million, and that was in the very final few days of the war. Actually, the final few hours. Before that, it's likely that many tens of millions of Cardassians, Jem'Hadar and Breen had died, and that's just on the Dominion side. On the Federation side, the numbers were very likely similar, with tens of millions dead. Worlds and economies crashed and into ruin. But how exactly did this war begin? Now, controversial take, which I did a video on a while back, was that actually the Federation provoked this war. Now, I'm not saying they were necessarily the aggressors, but usually Federation rules dictate that when an enemy power or territory, whatever, says you don't enter our space, the Federation normally respects that. But we do witness that several times throughout their history, Starfleet and the Federation will ignore this particular law. Kirk did it on numerous occasions. Janeway did it when she encountered, well, multiple civilizations that she would have been like, well, we've got to get through your territory. The Devore, for example, although there was an element of respect there. The Swarm, very notably, because their space was simply too big to go around, and that was too inconvenient. Although I have a whole question as to the depth of Swarm territory, how exactly, anyway. So the Borg, another one. But here we have the Federation kept going in. Now, that's a contentious debate as to whether or not they provoked it. The Federation, by this point, knew that without collapsing the wormhole, war was likely inevitable. There were multiple attempts as well provoking the Dominion by Alpha Quadrant powers, notably by the Tal Shiar and the Obsidian Order, who tried to wipe out the Changelings in an orbital bombardment. This failed catastrophically, resulting in the destruction of, well, the Obsidian Order pretty much completely, and the Tal Shiar being devastatingly crippled by the conflict. Section 31 would also attempt to wipe out the Changelings, although they did it a bit more insidiously, and by that point the war, although hadn't started, was by this point pretty much seen as inevitable. Of course, when the Dominion did finally invade the Alpha Quadrant, they did this passively. They would sign non-aggression treaties with races such as the Tholians, the Miradorn. The Cardassians would become members of the Dominion. The Orions would begin trading and working with them. The Sonar would begin trading and working with them. Of course, later the Breen would join. When the Cardassians first joined, the Cardassians had just come out of a devastating war with the Klingons. The Jem'Hadar would push the Klingons out of Cardassian space, and with Gul Dukat's proclamation that all Cardassian territory currently, which was held in the hands of some other alien belligerent, it would be reclaimed by his son's birthday, which was like a few days away. The Cardassians and the Dominion swept outwards, clearing out all the Klingons and then later the Maquis. We would later learn that near enough the entire Maquis would be wiped out. Eddington would help Sisko go in there and try to recover some survivors. We know a few would survive in prison, a few likely got out, but the Maquis was for all intents and purposes totally obliterated, and it's reasonable to conclude that all the Federation colonies within the DMZ were probably either annexed or more likely simply annihilated, which means really there is a small passive genocide took place there that we kind of forget about sometimes. Later, as the war would begin to hot up, later the Breen would join, but not before the Federation and the Klingons would go to war against the Dominion. And although the war in the early days would not go well for the Federation alliance, with multiple fleets being utterly annihilated, several fleets we saw reduced from over 100 ships to less than a dozen, and this happened more than once. The Dominion was able to build ships at an impressive rate, breed Jem'Hadar, as the Klingons would put it, faster than we could destroy them. The Federation, despite its vast resources and numbers, couldn't win in a war of attrition against them. The war was going badly. Deep Space Nine fell. The Chintaka system, which would be a later victory, would fall again after the Breen entered the war. The war basically had its ebbs and its flows. But the one real deciding factor in this war was when they convinced the Prophets, or the Wormhole Aliens, whatever you want to call them, to prevent over 3,000 Dominion ships and reinforcements coming through the wormhole. If they had come through, the war would have been over. We know this. It would have simply ended. Them doing that and then losing Deep Space Nine meant that the war would have to be fought purely with the resources they had to hand. And we believe that even without the minefield, the Dominion wouldn't risk sending more forces through the wormhole, at least not yet. So they began to fight with the resources they had at hand. Again, the Federation would turn the tables. They would take the Chintaka system. But then, as I said, the Breen would join. They would turn it around. The Chintaka system would fall. The Federation would counterattack and have its fleet utterly devastated. By this point, the Romulans have been drawn into the war by a bit of manipulation and machinations of one Captain Benjamin Sisko and Elam Garak, one minor little assassination and a couple of murders, and, you know, the Romulans are in the war. Happy days. We needed their help. And despite the way they were brought into it, it would ultimately save more lives. There is a moral quandary on this, of course. It's a grey area, much like Section 31. I'm sure they were very proud of Captain Sisko for his actions, but it brought the Romulans into the war. There was an attack directly against Earth by the Breen, which had basically scared everyone into this. Like, we need to turn the tables on this war. We need to do something. There were multiple instances in the war of heroism on both sides. Some notable examples were on a planet in an episode we know as Rocks and Shoals, where a captured Dominion ship crashed on a planet. We found that there were already some Jem'Hadar and Vorta there, and we got to know the ins and outs of the Dominion, the real dynamic between the Jem'Hadar and the Vorta. We'd seen it before, where the Jem'Hadar don't trust the Vorta, and the Vorta mistreat the Jem'Hadar. The internal weaknesses of the Dominion were on show here, and it was something that was never truly something the Federation could exploit, but it was something to keep in mind. The Dominion was not as impregnable and as perfect as it liked to portray itself as, which can say the Federation never tries to say it's perfect, but they're trying to do their best, whereas the Dominion was simply trying to gain power and control. The steps that, as I said, led up to the war, in my opinion, were very provocative by the Federation. The capturing of a Jem'Hadar attack ship, the constant incursions into Dominion space, the Cardassian and Romulan attempts to destabilize the Dominion by wiping out the Changelings, and then various powers in the Alpha Quadrant creating impressive inroads, as Odo would put it, into the Alpha Quadrant, signing non-aggression pacts and other treaties with the Dominion. This undermined a lot of the power and resistance to the Dominion forces as they first came in, and their actions early on were not exactly pleasant. Kicked the Klingons' asses, fine, they were at war with the Cardassians. The Cardassians is now members of the Dominion, that's understandable. But then, the wiping out of the Maquis, an enemy that really was no match for them, that set the tone for the upcoming war. And although the war would only last 2 years, and the Federation had had other wars that had lasted far longer than this in its history, as well as ongoing Cold War conflicts with the Klingons, the Romulans, Gorn maybe, this was a different type of conflict. It was all-out total war where both sides would commit atrocities. Both sides would commit crimes. Both sides would show their true colors. But just what were the two sides of this war? On the one hand, let's explore the Dominion. The Dominion was a dark reflection of the Federation in many ways. It had vast resources and vast forces in the Gamma Quadrant, but unlike the Federation, it was a dictatorship, almost an oligarchy, with the royal founders at the top, the Vorta nobles in the middle, and the warrior class, the Jem'Hadar next, and everyone else were the serfs and the peasants. The Dominion was a collection of many different civilizations forcibly forced to work together, or conquered or destroyed by the Jem'Hadar. Do as you're told or else was basically the rule of the Dominion. In terms of its tactical capabilities, aside from the vast resources and political power that it commanded in the Gamma Quadrant, it had a multitude of advanced starships. The most common was the Jem'Hadar attack ship. Now, there is some debate in canon over how big these ships were. We can chalk some of it up to possibly variants of the same ships, with some of them seeming to be around the 160 meters in length mark, whereas others seem to be far smaller in scaling. But generally speaking, they were impressive vessels, but they lacked armor and adequate shielding. The way the Dominion operated its ships was remarkably different to that of the Federation. There was no sick bays aboard these ships, no crew quarters, limited cargo capacity. They were A to B ships. They relied on very powerful and advanced weapons, and their power distribution grids and other vector systems were very alien to those of the Federation. Although they put out a lot of energy, they lacked a lot of the same components and worked differently on a lot of different set of principles, possibly less stably, but were definitely more powerful. And although Jem'Hadar ships weren't as fast as some of the fastest Federation vessels, they did have a very high sustainable cruise velocity. They were armed with polaron-based weapons primarily, and some kind of torpedo, most likely quantum, but it's possible that they simply could fire whatever kind of torpedo they happened to be armed with. They also occasionally used disruptors. They didn't seem to utilize any kind of cloaking technology, and the shields on their vessels were actually surprisingly weak compared to Federation shields, as was the armor of these ships. Once you could get through those systems, the vessels were actually relatively easy to destroy for the much more powerful Federation vessels that were a bit more of a titan by comparison in a lot of ways. The Jem'Hadar attack ships made up for this, with their shields being designed to prevent lock-on of tractor beams and of other systems, making it harder to hit them. They were very fast and very maneuverable, especially at sublight speeds. These ships had a lot of punch, and quite frankly, the tenacity and aggression of the Jem'Hadar on board made up for a lot of the ship's shortcomings. Also, they would usually attack in numbers, patrolling in groups of 3 to 5, usually groups of 3. It wasn't unusual for these ships to operate on their own. Despite their small size and seeming limited capabilities, these vessels were also used for research purposes, patrol missions, as well as offensive missions, and even diplomatic purposes on occasion. They were also used for stealthier, more espionage-like missions because they were small size and relatively difficult silhouette to detect. They were narrow ships, so automatically coming at you, they were harder to hit. Most of their firepower faced forwards, meaning only limited weaponry was after the ship. They had a general bug-like appearance, almost like a scarab beetle-like design from Earth, but it's not known if that was a deliberate design aesthetic. The Dominion, of course, had much larger, heavily armed cruisers. The main two types of the Dominion warship, which was roughly comparable to a Galaxy-class starship in size, but was substantially more powerful. Again, similar armament layouts. It had much heavier armor and shielding, of course, than the Jem'Hadar attack ship. Was designed to be more of a brawler. These vessels were also occasionally used as diplomatic craft. One interesting note about the internals of all their ships: they didn't have view screens, with relatively few of the crew actually using these headsets that allowed them to have a sort of heads-up display literally inside their head, allowing them to look outside the ship and get sensor data directly to them. And wherever they looked, they could see outside the ship. The rest of the crew had to rely on monitor screens. Only the first Jem'Hadar and the Vorta were given one of these headsets. Cardassians were seen to also be able to use them, whereas humans struggled getting headaches when they were utilizing them. It's either possible that the technology was adapted for the Cardassians, or that Cardassian physiology was more compatible. That's never been exactly clear. I would guess that they adapted it to be more compatible with the Cardassians, rather than Cardassians just naturally being good and able to use it. The largest Dominion ship was the battleship. Again, there's some ambiguity about exactly how big this ship is. Scaling was always a problem. These ships have scaling ranges varying from about 1,200 meters, similar in size to a D'Iberville-class warbird, to over 3,000 meters. It's not clear, just to point that out. There are many different sources, and based on what you see on screen, but again, forced perspective, I would go, these ships are probably on the smaller end of that scale, not the massive end of that scale, but they were certainly the most powerful ship operating during the war. No singular Allied vessel could go up against one on its own. These ships were marauders and often sent out on their own, as well as to work as the sort of head of a battle group. They could take on any ship the Allies had and win. In fact, they could take on a few. There was a very unsuccessful attempt by a rogue Starfleet vessel of Defiant class, thinking it had found a weakness in these ships, to destroy it, which proved, again, as I said, unsuccessful, resulting in the destruction of that ship and the near loss of all hands. On the Allied side, of course, we have Starfleet, supported by the Greater Federation. So like 200 member races, their fleets and navies, and the vast resources behind it. There are too many types of ship within Starfleet to mention, so we'll do the highlights. First of all, as a fighting class, you've got the Defiant class warships, later the Prometheus class vessels developed, the Akira, Sabre, Norway, Steamrunner class vessels, all built as anti-board ships originally, but are very excellent combatants against the Jem'Hadar. Sovereign class vessels were less common, and because of the massive redistribution of forces against the Dominion Sovereign class ships like the Enterprise and the Sovereign were sent out on deeper range missions, and very rarely seemed to engage directly into the Dominion War itself, Starfleet relying on Galaxy class and other such vessels to assist in that role. As combatants, as people, of course, there was the vast resources that supported it, Starfleet officers. There was also the Starfleet Marines and general other military personnel within the Starfleet. And yes, Starfleet and the Federation does have a military wing with officers like generals and colonels with those sorts of ranks existing within the Federation. They're just very small and we don't see much of them. In the past, during the Romulan Wars, we would have known these as the Makos, but when the Makos are folded into Starfleet, we get the Starfleet Marines. We just see very little of them. We do see them deployed, however, during the Dominion War, and many Starfleet officers drafted into a combat role. Bear in mind, security personnel are not soldiers. They are security. Of course, then we have the other allied states. The Klingons, again, the diversity of their navy is a bit too much to go into, but principally you've got the Birds of Prey, the Vorchak class attack cruisers, and various types of battle cruisers that made up the bulk of the Klingon navy. The Negvars were relatively rare, similar to the Dominion battleship. There weren't many of them, but they did exist, and they were used again as command and control vessels or as marauding ships. The Negvars were very powerful, and we saw people like Gowron use one as his flagship. But again, there weren't many of them. The Romulans, again, their navy quite diverse, but we'll say the Diderotix class warbird was probably the most ubiquitous vessel the Romulans deployed during the war as their principal vessel. Later they would develop offshoots of this class, and we do see there were other classes of warbird in the Romulan navy at this time, but the Diderotix was probably the predominant and preeminent vessel the Romulans were able to deploy. And of course they also deployed the massive numbers of Reman and Reman ships, because again the Reman do have canonical vessels, their own warbirds and their own fighting ships. It's not exactly beyond too much suspension of disbelief to believe the Romulans would also deploy the Reman forces against the Dominion in space as well as on the ground. Notably, we have Shinzon, who was a clone of Captain Picard. Very big story there, not relevant to this, but he was one of the principal Reman commanders, was highly successful in his campaigns against the Jem'Hadar. Other major powers in the Alpha and Beta quadrants didn't seem to participate in the war directly, remaining neutral. The Ferengi, for example, took a neutral stance officially, but unofficially they did heavily support the Federation allies against the Dominion. But their neutral standing did give them some. The Orions seemed to side with the Dominion a little bit. The Breen obviously turned onto the Dominion side, and there was other races like the Miradorn that were neutral. Races like the Gorn didn't get involved, the Sheliak, neutral, so other major powers kind of stayed out of it. The Allied powers that did work with the Dominion, of course, notably there was the Cardassians. The Cardassian Navy, again, is a relatively diverse thing, but the predominant vessels of the Cardassian Navy were the Galler-class warships, the Keldon-class warships, and the Hideki-class patrol vessels or slash fighters. These were the principal fighting vessels utilized and deployed by the Cardassians en masse. There are many variants of these classes, but they are principally it. There are multiple Cardassian military orders, and their navy was quite large, but a singular Cardassian vessel was not really much of a threat to a Klingon, Federation, or Romulan ship. Like the Jem'Hadar, they kind of relied on numbers. The Breen, however, who joined the war, were a different story. Now, although it was stated in canon that the Breen utilized biomechanical technology, they actually deployed hardened metal ships constructed from, well, metal during this war, the so-called Breen warship, which was a fairly interesting asymmetrically designed vessel. The kind of weapons these ships carried were not dissimilar to the Cardassians, disruptors, torpedoes, but the energy dissipator weapons were the most powerful weapon they brought to the conflict. The weapon did no damage in and of itself. In fact, the damage it did was transitory, it was only minor. But a single hit from this weapon could incapacitate the most powerful Federation, Romulan, and Klingon ships without special modifications to their warp engines, which the Klingons stumbled upon by accident, which actually prevented the weapon from working. And eventually this modification will be rolled out to the rest of the Allies, but initially only Klingon vessels were immune. The energy dissipator would later be retrofitted onto Dominion ships as well, because most of the Dominion's enemies likely wouldn't actually be able to resist this weapon the same as the Federation's allies were able to do. It basically knocked out much of the main power on a ship, rendering it incapable of maneuvering, communicating, firing its weapons, raising its shields, and then it makes it an easy target, and the entire fleet are torn apart. This is how the Breen were able to retake the Chintaka system. And although this presented a massive tactical advantage during the early stages of the Breen's entry into the war, eventually the Allies were able to counter this technology using typical Federation resourcefulness, although it was based on Klingon research. So it was actually the Klingons that developed the counter to it, but it was the Federation and the others who figured out how to defend everything else. Of course, there are many other elements that went into this war: the development of self-replicating mines, anti-changeling nets and other technologies, as well as various tactics to defeat both Cardassian, Breen, and generally Dominion tactics during the conflict, the Cardassian resistance that rose up against them, and very likely limited support from other governments that were not directly involved in the war, supplying information and resources to both sides, such as the sonar, for example, helping the Dominion. But overall, the war was a war of attrition, one that the Cardassians suffered probably the worst casualties for. And although the Allies came out victorious, the scars of that war would be felt many decades later, when a group of rogue changelings would attempt, well, retribution against the Federation, along with the Borg. Another story for another time. But that is the overall Dominion War and its belligerents. Who they were and what their goals were all differed. There is an allegory to many extreme militant regimes throughout our history. The lesson to be learned is that no empire lasts forever. Eventually there's always a bigger fish, effectively. Someone's going to come down and knock you off your high horse. No population or civilization or culture can be suppressed by force of arms alone forever. Eventually, through internal machinations, external assistance, uprisings from within, every empire throughout history has fallen to its own greed, overextending, avarice, ego, or generally just running into someone bigger and tougher than them. This war was an ideological war, but also a war for survival. The Federation and its allies, despite their differences between the Federation, the Romulans, and the Klingons, old hatreds, really deep-seated hatreds between the Klingons and the Romulans, had to be put aside to fight a bigger threat to both of them, the Dominion. A Federation distrust and dislike of the Cardassians was settled here in a lot of ways. I'm sure many Starfleet officers went into that conflict with revenge for the Federation colonists that were massacred, along with the Maquis. There was a lot of Federation resentment and sympathy for the Maquis. Many within Starfleet and across the Federation and on Earth didn't approve of the treaty. And the border wars with the Cardassians, the Cardassian atrocities against the Federation, were remembered and not forgotten by this point, with many people demonstrating in the years up to this war, such as Captain Maxwell, that those scars ran deep. This war was brewing in the background for years before it ever happened. Tensions between the Federation and the Cardassians. Yes, the Klingons and the Romulans didn't go to war with each other, but Romulan neutrality probably could have provoked that at some point. Point is, the major powers, the great powers of the Alpha Quadrant, came together in unity against a common enemy. Yes, the alliance broke down afterwards, but it strengthened relations between the Federation and the Klingons. The Romulans will be neutralized eventually anyway. The Cardassians will weaken and eventually fold into the Federation at some point. And although we don't know yet the true fate of the Dominion, we do know that the lesson learned was don't bite off more than you can chew, that dictatorships and tyrants all come to a bloody, violent end eventually. and the Federation and its allies proved that. But that is, as I said, the overall Dominion War. Again, the Dominion not totally, utterly, completely defeated, but its tactics and brutality and savagery, although made it strong and powerful, also hardened resistance against them, which is the one real side effect when you are that violent, when you try to take what's not yours, when you try to steal other people's freedoms from them and oppress them. This is the response that you get, even from other somewhat malicious powers. You will ultimately lose. And although the war was very violent and bloody, it was a war worth fighting. Anyway, that is the end of this video and the total Dominion War. If you have any thoughts on the Dominion War you'd like to share, put them in the comment section down below. I'd love to hear them. And with that said, if you made it all to the end of the video, I thank you for watching. Bye-bye.